Part one of this class addressed some fundamental and foundational concepts regarding what constitutes an effective assessment. And for some of you, you might have thought that learning more about validity, reliability, and fairness were things that were not of that great interest to you, both personally and perhaps even professionally if you happen to be teaching right now. But those concepts are crucial in order to sort of really fundamentally understand what I think is the most important part of this class, which is part two of the class. And that's where we're at right now. Because part two of the class addresses how do you create valid, reliable, and fair assessments. And in order to learn that, you are going to learn about a number of rules that you should follow when you're either revising an existing assessment or creating your own. And so learning those rules and how to apply them to the development of your own assessments is something that, first of all, I think you'll find very more interesting and motivating to learn about. And also definitely a skill set that you're going to use as an educator almost every day of your job. So part two is very, very different from part one. If part one was more theoretical, part two is 100% practical. And so what's interesting about the notes for part two is that if you look at the notes that are posted on the website, you'll see for part two that there really aren't that many. They're really basic, but many of the notes make a reference to something called the Assessment Development Guide, and that's a separate document that I prepared for you, and hopefully you've downloaded it, or you will download it for part two. And that really constitutes the fundamental notes for part two, because it outlines all of the basic rules that you need to follow in order to create good assessments or to identify good assessments, whether you obtained assessments from other teachers or from online or from the back of a textbook. What you'll learn about that, or what you've already learned about that as a professional educator, is that oftentimes assessments that are made by somebody else may not be at a level of quality that could assure you as a professional that they are valid, reliable, and fair. And I'll give you an example from my own teaching that really speaks to how important it is to be able to do a good job of identifying what's good and not good, and also of creating something that's good. And that is, when I started my teaching career, I was a science teacher, mostly 8th and 9th grade life sciences. Life science in 8th grade, and then in 9th grade was biology. And I had a number of students at the beginning of the year communicate to me that they hated science. They hated the subject matter, and they hated all the stuff they had to learn, all the information they had to learn in science. And it just wasn't anything that they were interested in. And I found that a really fascinating perspective, because I too love science. It's why I went into wanting to be a science teacher and why I became one initially. But what was interesting is I never once saw science as a bunch of really interesting information. I always saw science as a way of looking at the world, and as a way of thinking about the world, and as a way of sort of doing something about what I was curious about, just as a human being, walking the earth. And so I realized early on with my students that it was going to be really important for me to, number one, help them learn how to think scientifically. That was really important. So think scientifically. And then number two, I wanted them to appreciate that about science. I wanted them to have positive attitudes about science. I never wanted them ever again to walk into a science class and say that they hated science. So those were two areas, thinking scientifically and adopting highly positive attitudes about science, that were, those two areas were not assessed in any way, shape, or form by what was in the textbooks that they were assigned by the school district, or what was already something that they had already sort of been exposed to, or even any resources I got from previous teachers. None of that addressed those two areas. So those were two things that I needed to create myself. I needed to get good at it. So I did a lot of searching for, well, how do you measure scientific thinking? What are some good ways to do that? And it turns out I found a number of assessments that had been developed and also tested and revised that proposed to measure scientific thinking, scientific reasoning, and that was really interesting, because once I realized what constituted scientific thinking from an assessment perspective, well, then I had to go and figure out how then do I teach my students how to think scientifically? How can I teach them so that they can actually perform the skills that were measured on those assessments? And so that sort of way of looking at my job absolutely transformed what I did, from starting off being the kind of teacher that influenced me, to being the kind of teacher that was focused on helping my students learn important things. Scientific reasoning was important, and also positive attitudes about science were very important. And those attitudes were things that my students needed to learn. They had to learn how to make choices, for example, that reflected a positive attitude about science. So I had to do a lot of assessment development in order to be able to meet my personal needs as an educator. So in part two, you're going to be learning about how you identify what's a good assessment and what isn't. And you're also going to learn more about how can you measure things like higher level reasoning skills or thinking skills versus verbal information or knowledge, versus attitudes. So there's a whole section in part two about measuring attitudes or affective outcomes, outcomes about what learners, how they feel about certain things. And so again, part two is going to be very applied. And the project for part two is very much applied and very, very much a part of the way teachers do their jobs now that they didn't do a couple of years ago. So for the project, you're going to use artificial intelligence to generate outcomes, or I should say, generate assessments that you think would measure the specific things you want them to measure, and then you're gonna analyze what AI came up with regarding how valid the items appear, how reliable they might be in terms of administering them, and also whether or not there are things about the outcomes that might be unfair for certain kinds of learners. So you're not actually going to be developing a lot of items in part two, but you are going to be applying the rules for development to be able to identify what might be potentially good or not good about some existing items, and you're going to use AI to help you identify and generate some of those items. Again, always based on what you want your students to be able to do as a result of your class. So That is part 2. Very different from part 1.